Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lucas Guriati, and I am a senior at CU studying international affairs pursuing a certificate in peace, conflict, and security studies. And I am also the chair of the International Affairs Committee with the Conference on World Affairs. For recording purposes, today is Thursday, April 10th, 2025. It is 2 p.m., and this is panel number 18146, titled After the War, Post-Conflict Development and Building for the Future. Before we get started today, the University of Colorado, Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. One thing I'd like to mention is that we want to be sure you, the audience, gets a chance to ask questions. Here's how we'll handle the Q&A. We'll reserve the end of the discussion for that Q&A. We're using a note card system to receive questions from the audience. At any time in the session, simply raise your hand to request a note card and pencil from one of our producers. Please write legibly. If you're a student, please note this in your question on the card. When you finish, raise your hand to the producer who will bring it up to me. I would urge everyone to please make your questions brief and to the point. And now I'd like to do a brief introduction of each panelist. For more information, you can find their full bios on the CWA website. So starting all the way at the end is Rania El-Malki. Rania is a professor of practice in the journalism program at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies, where she teaches video journalism, news writing, multimedia platforms, multimedia storytelling, and documentary production. She also serves as an editor at IGAB, a platform supporting journalists from the Middle East and Africa in publishing internationally. El-Malki holds a Master's of Fine Arts in Documentary Production and Studies from the University of North Texas, and a master's degree in journalism with distinction from Westminster University in London, where she was a Chevening Scholar. Her career transitioned to documentary filmmaking and academia after a distinguished tenure as a reporter and editor, including 6 years as editor-in-chief of the Cairo-based daily News in Egypt, then local publishing partner of the International Herald Tribune. To her left is John Heffernan, who is the president of the Foundation for Systemic Change. He has over 30 years of experience in development, human rights, rule of law, democracy, and governance, as well as humanitarian relief and post-conflict reconstruction projects in the United States, Africa, South America, Asia, and Europe. He has served as executive director of Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Speak Truth to Power, director of genocide prevention initiatives at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where he established the Genocide Prevention Task Force, Senior Institute for the International Affairs in Guyana, South America, founder and executive director of the Coalition of International Justice, and country representative for the former Yugoslavia and Sudan for the International Rescue Committee. He was trained as a community organizer by the Red Cross. He serves as the board chair for Disability Rights International Educators Instituted for Human Rights, and is on the board of Social Documentary Network, and recently was the executive producer of a documentary called American Agitators, focusing on grassroots social movements. Next, we have Dr. Michael English, who is a specialist in conflict analysis and resolution. He holds a PhD in conflict analysis and resolution from George Mason, a master's in conflict resolution from Portland State University, and a BFA in fine arts from the University of Cincinnati. Prior to joining CU Boulder, Michael taught at George Mason University School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, and is a visiting lecturer at the University of Malta's Mediterranean Academy for Diplomatic Studies. He's also lived and worked in Malta as the program coordinator for the George Mason's dual degree program with the University of Malta in Mediterranean Security and Conflict Analysis Resolution. Michael is the author of The Institute of Peace, A Critical History, and former editor of Unrest magazine. His research explores the interaction between people and social structures that creates and maintains violence-generating systems, as well as opportunities for groups to develop more peaceful social orders. And finally, we have Jim Middleman, who is a distinguished research professor and university professor emeritus at American University. His work focuses on globalization, development, knowledge production, and political economy. Previously, he was professor and dean at Queens College of the City University of New York, professor and dean of Graduate School of International Studies, today the Corbel School at the University of Denver, and the Pak Rafaya Chair at the National University of Malaysia. Middleman has been on the faculty at Cornell and Columbia Universities and was a member of the Princeton Institute for Advanced Study. He is also the recipient of the International Studies Association's 2010 Distinguished Scholar Award in International Political Economy. He is an honorary fellow at Helsinki Collegium for Advanced Studies. Middleman's books include The Globalization Syndrome, Transformation and Resistance, and Implausible Dream, Repurposing Higher Education, both published by Princeton University Press. Middleman makes frequent media appearances, and his writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Financial Times, and The Nation. And with that, I think we can get started with our discussion about post-conflict development and building for the future. I would just like to start by posing a broad question to each of you about what generally is the history of conflict development. What were some failures and what were some successes throughout the 20th century and so on. And if you don't mind, Rania, would you please get us started?
I do mind. I don't want to go first. Maybe Professor, I came to the site so you wouldn't pick on me first, actually.
Are we?
Shall we start with
ladies
Professor
first, please.
Please go ahead.
No.
No.
I'll go first.
Okay.
Let's fight for this. This is going to be post-conflict resolution here. Thanks, Luca. And Luca and I talked about, when was it first? I think it was before Christmas, probably back in November. And so it's great to be here. This is actually my fourth time, and it's really one of the highlights of my year. I love coming to this conference. I get so much from it, and I'm able to take back to Washington, D.C. As Luca indicated in my CV and my bio, I've worked in a number of conflicts. I worked in Sudan for a number of years for the International Rescue Committee, working with Eritreans and Ethiopians that had fled the war and famine there, sought refuge in Khartoum. And then I went on to work in the former Yugoslavia. I think it was 1993 when I first got there in the middle of the war. It was interesting coming in from Sudan because it was before the internet, and we would get the only kind of communication from the outside world is we would get a Newsweek once a month. And then there was one Newsweek edition that had, I don't know whether she was Princess Diana or Lady, I think she was Princess Diana at the time, and it showed cleavage. So every single Newsweek had a Sharpie covering the cleavage of Princess Diana, and then we didn't get any communication after that. So I knew very little about the former Yugoslavia, but when I went there with IRC, it was a smallish program that just kind of mushroomed into a very large program. I think at one point it was the largest humanitarian relief program in the history of the world since Europe. And thousands of people were dying. And we had a pretty extensive program. A lot of money was being poured into the program, but people continued to die. It's not that I don't think that our program was useful, but after a while I thought maybe all of this international humanitarian assistance could have also been perpetuating the conflict, and that fact that it was giving people an excuse not to do what was needed. And I felt strongly that a humanitarian intervention was needed to end this conflict. I think at one point we got up to something like 250,000 people dead. And after 3 years or so, I chose to leave. It was something that was difficult to make that decision, but part of it was that I saw my confidence in humankind just diminishing. And I didn't want to be that person, and I didn't think I was the right person for that job. So I left, and I didn't know what I was going to do, but I ended up in Washington, D.C., and in a somewhat kind of cathartic moment, I decided to create an organization called the Coalition for International Justice. And it was really an organization that was created by then the Soros Foundation. And a number of people who had been working on international justice for many, many years. This is pre the International Criminal Court. And they had created these ad hoc tribunals to prosecute the bad guys in Yugoslavia and Rwanda. And it had never been done before since World War II, since the Nuremberg trials. So they really felt it was important, they being these people who had been focused on this for many, many years, international humanitarian law, and felt that it was important to have an organization that could support the work of the tribunals. And so I felt, not only personally, but also just from a post-conflict perspective, that it was critical to have some sort of accountability, that people needed to take responsibility for what had happened in the former Yugoslavia, that this was critical for the recovery of these people. So I did that for 3 years, and would love to talk a little bit more about that. But my experience in post-conflict situations has largely been devoted to transitional justice. I also spent a number of years focused on Afghanistan and discovered a mass grave outside of Mazar-e-Sharif, working for Physicians for Human Rights. And my goal was to find out who was in that grave and how could we investigate it and how we can preserve that grave. And once we find out who's in it, how can we return these people to their loved ones? Afghanistan is riddled with mass graves. And again, I thought that was an important part of post-conflict. We haven't been able to do that for obvious reasons in Afghanistan. But that was it was, again, largely focused on transitional justice issues.
I can go now, if you want. No problem, now that you started us off. All right, so my background is obviously in journalism. I've been a journalist since in Egypt for 15 years, and I covered the uprising and the aftermath of the uprising over there. And as an editor right now with IGAB, as Luca explained, I work a lot with journalists inside Palestine, in Syria, in Lebanon, to cover a lot of the news that's coming out. So stories written by journalists on the ground in all these different countries that are published in the international media. So taking it from from that perspective, so my experience in Egypt has been really interesting in terms of post-conflict, because the uprising was quite violent. I don't think I don't think there's been enough emphasis on how many people died during the uprising, but at least 1,000 people during the actual 18-day protests in the very early days. And then later on, when there was a military coup that was kind of the counter-revolution. That's what happened. So in Egypt, the experience had been, as we covered it, was really interesting, because at the beginning, obviously, the focus has to be on security, because when there are fluid situations like that, there's no security, people get very anxious, and then all kinds of crimes can start to happen. And so what communities did at the time was create these popular committees during the 18 days that were just protecting their own neighborhoods. And then later on, we kind of moved on quickly into a political process, which I think was way too fast. It was very important, to start for the state to reinforce its legitimacy. But at the time, we were calling for the head of the regime, which was the 30-year president of the country, to leave power, and obviously everyone who was around him had to leave as well. But who was going to, replace them? There was a void of some kind, and so we ended up having elections, which I think very too early, and the elections brought in people who were very divisive, but they were legitimately, voted into office. So we had parliamentary elections, and then a year later we had, less than a year later, we had presidential elections, which brought in a president who was people were divided over him, because the choice was between, the devil in the deep blue sea. Do we go back to someone who represented the old regime, or someone who was part of the resistance but is not popular? So there's always this, in these fluid situations, there's always this, contradiction. I'm seeing something similar happening now in Syria as we're covering it. I don't know if you all are familiar with what's going on in Syria, where there's been a civil war well, actually, there's a lot of people involved. It's not only a civil war, lots of proxy wars going on in Syria for the past 13 years. And in December, the rebels, the rebel militias, however we want to call them, different people call them different things depending on where you are in the world and all that. And they're now in charge, and so they're trying to have a dialogue about the future and about coming together in a place that's very ethnically divided. So, it's a really, really messy situation from my perspective as a journalist, because covering it day in, day out from the perspectives of all the different minorities and the people who belong to like, for example, we have journalists in Syria who were Alawites, and this was the ethnicity of the ruling regime. And so their perspective is really, really biased, and on the other hand, we have the other side. So it's a very, very sensitive period. But I think that the most important thing that needs to be dealt with in situations of conflict is to stop the armed conflict, right? So I'm talking about Gaza, for example. Like in Gaza, there was a ceasefire in January, and then it was supposed to move into the second phase, which did not happen. And now, the enclave is being bombed again. For the past 35 years, no humanitarian aid has been, for 35 days, no humanitarian aid has been allowed to go into Gaza. Electricity switched off, the water switched off, so people are starving, food is being weaponized. So how do we deal with situations where the conflict will not end? It's, I'm sure the rest of the panel is going to elaborate on this, but this is my perspective from my part of the world.
Sure. Okay. Well, thank you all. Thank you, Luca, for doing this, and for everybody at CWA, and for you all for being here. I think when I look out, I am happy you're here, but I think this is always the challenge. Those of us that are interested in anything that gets labeled post-conflict deal with is that, if it was like violence, killing, and terror, as we talked about on Tuesday, packed house. The minute you take the word violence out of this, or you're like, oh, they've stopped shooting at each other, the interest level in all things post-conflict evaporates. And so I'm really happy to be on a panel with three other folks who can offer all kinds of different perspectives for you on this. I will take the conflict to post-conflict part, because I'm sitting next to Professor Middleman, and I know all development and economic things related. He is going to tell you how it is, and I will happy to cede that territory.
Don't get your expectations up too high. I'm being set up.
You're being set up, but importantly set up, because I think that when we think about these ideas of conflict and post-conflict, one of the things that we tend to teach students about is this idea that, you know, when people start paying attention to conflict, if you think about a bell curve, right, and on this left-hand side of the bell curve is this thing called escalation, where you have a situation of no conflict that runs all the way to the top of the curve that is war, right? That more often than not, when people say, is a conflict going on, they're not paying attention to all of the escalatory steps that have happened before that. They're paying attention to this thing called war, because war is awful, and unless you're Sudan, gets attention from the world, right? But even sometimes then, it doesn't get attention from the world. On the kind of flip side, on the right side, you would have what we think about as often de-escalation, right? What are all of the things now going on to get that situation, whether it's between countries or a civil war situation between people in society, back down to something that you may say is quote unquote normal life, if such a thing can be reconstituted in a post-conflict setting. And so when you start saying, you know, post-conflict, it becomes really important to specify, well, where in that kind of de-escalation arc are we saying we're at with post-conflict? Development is certainly one of those things that you can do post-conflict, but there are a whole lot of other things, right? When you started to talk about ceasefires, there are negotiated settlements, there are political institution rebuilding, security arrangements. Those are all great, but then there's also all of this stuff that has to go on when you start to say, well, how do we get these people to actually want to live with one another again, right? How do we get these folks to exist in the same space, if such a thing is possible? And the nice thing about that bell curve idea is that the kind of longer you're going along the curve, that's going out in time, right? So something that you've broken in terms of a society in a number of days or years with war is now getting into the point where it's going to take decades, if not generations, for you to fix what you just destroyed. And so, you know, thinking about post-conflict isn't just, hey, the guns have stopped shooting. It's, what are we going to do with all of these other things? And you know, John's work on thinking about conflict prevention is equally important, right? Because now you're saying it's not only important that we think about what's going on this de-escalation side, but what happens on the escalation side? How do you start to intervene sooner so that you don't get to the point at which everything is destroyed? And I think, you know, there's lots for us to talk about in this regard, but it's also important to appreciate that even when we start using these terms post-conflict, post-conflict doesn't mean you go back to normal. Post-conflict means that you are now dealing with a radically new situation in which all of the relations in that society or between those groups have changed, and that your new starting point for whatever conflict may come is going to be determined by how you tried to resolve that situation. So if you did better, right, if you're moving in a progressive direction and you're getting back to normalization of relations, what you're hoping is that at the end of the day, this society or these countries are more resilient and able to manage their problems without recourse to violence. If you've failed and all you've done is get a ceasefire, there is no reason you should not pretend that that ceasefire is eventually probably going to be broken and people are going to go back to violence fairly quickly, and it's going to just keep that cycle spinning. I will stop there and pass it over to Professor Middleman.
Yeah. Okay. I want to thank the organizers of this conference. It's really done a wonderful job. And this is my first time at the Conference on World Affairs. I moved to Boulder 5 years ago. I think I hit the jackpot in terms of coming here. So it's really been terrific, but I'm a newbie at this conference. What I'd like to do is share some of my own experiences with you. Not that my autobiography is very interesting, but what have I learned and where do I gather this from? I've had the good fortune of just being in the right place and working with two Nobel laureates, prize winners for the Peace Prize, Wangari Maathai, a Kenyan woman, and Martti Ahtisaari, the former president of Finland. I've been able to absorb a lot. I hope some of it has rubbed off on me. And I've had quite a few memorable experiences, one of which was landing in a detention center in rural Mozambique, being rounded up with what they call banditos, criminals with outlaws, and being kept inside there. And I've taken some things away from these experiences, and I was at one point sent by the UN Commissioner for Namibia to Havana, and what we were doing was brainstorming on how to break apartheid South Africa's illegal hold over what it called Southwest Africa at the time. And I think I've learned a great deal from this. And then later, I've been called in by the United Nations Development Program and by UNESCO to evaluate many of their own projects for post-war reconstruction. I can go into this in question and answer, but I was very critical of the types of things that they were doing. So, in short, what are some of my takeaways from these experiences? I started with the premise, a very simple premise, which I think is correct, that all wars end. But the big question is, how do wars end? And I think to answer this question, and Luca posed a question at the beginning about change, what has changed in this field, is that we need context, we need history. Various conferences that I'm involved in, including this one, are very presentist. You know, the word presentist is a dirty word used by historians. It's a swear word, presentist, not to look at the historical trajectory of the whole context, the way things are changing. So there are various means by which wars end. Let me name three of them. One is outright victory, such as at the end of World War II. Secondly, there are negotiated peace settlements. For example, between Ethiopia and Eritrea, although there are occasional outbreaks of violence since the agreement was reached. Then there are stalemates, where war just quiets down, but there's never an agreement as such. And of course, there are different kinds of wars. There are interstate wars, and there are civil wars. Civil wars going on today in Myanmar, in Syria, in Yemen, in Sudan. Maybe there's a civil war in the making in the United States. But this would be Civil War number 2. Civil War number 1 never ended in the United States. Still fighting about monuments, about memorials, about naming, about renaming. You know, who was it? William Faulkner, the novelist, said, history is never dead. It never dies out. And we are still trying to deal with these memories in the United States as they are in other parts of the world. As Luca mentioned at the beginning, I spend part of every year in Finland where I work. They had a civil war there in 1917, right after they became independent. There was a red Finland and a white Finland at the time. There were child soldiers that were used. These are very painful memories that are rarely discussed in Finland. So we have to go deeply into the memories and the stories that are told. And now we're hearing different stories about Ukraine, for example. You know, what was the source of the conflict there? So the data show that 40% of wars end with a formal agreement, only 40%. 60% of all wars end in some type of compromise that is reached, often without an agreement as such. So in my plea to be historical and to be contextual, rather than to decontextualize these big issues, I want to say a few words about the 30 Years' War. Who can tell me who fought in the 30 Years' War? Anyone quickly? It's a quiz. I'm a professor as well as a journalist. You want a passing grade, don't you? When was it?
1670, 1700.
Pretty good, 1616 to 1648.
Whoa.
Yeah, you get an A in the course, all right? That was the war between the Catholics and the Protestants, which ended with the Treaty of Westphalia. That's not the 30-year war that I have experience with. I want to talk about the 30-year war in Southern Africa, from the 1960s to the 1990s, where I had some own experience. These were the apartheid wars. You know, the apartheid regime made raids into neighboring countries. Some of my colleagues at Eduardo Mondlane University in Mozambique were killed. They were assassinated. They went into Namibia, they went into Zambia, they went into Malawi, and so on. 30 years of wars that took place in Southern Africa until the 1990s. So, coming to our topic today, post-war rebuilding. What has happened after these outbreaks of war? Well, the liberation movements, they had to become governments. They had to become political parties. And it's not easy to convert a liberation movement, such as Frelimo in Mozambique, or the ANC in South Africa, SWAPO in Namibia, into a political party. And what these groups have tried to do, the liberation movements, is to play on the heroic narrative, the narrative that they were heroes in the struggle, that they led the struggle, and therefore vote for us, support us, because we were at the spearhead of the struggle. But they have not really dealt with the structural inequalities in society. In fact, in many cases, they have become much worse, with new elites coming into power, and large parts of the populations have been further marginalized. So there is an old slogan that's been used for many years after the wars, "A luta continua," the struggle continues. But today, the people say, the looting continues. Not a luta continua, but the looting continues by an elite within these countries. So there has been a certain betrayal that has taken place there. And this is what leads me to my conclusion, is that we can, talk a lot about the kinds of Band-Aid approaches that have been used to try to settle or tamp down certain conflicts in the world. In my own experience, and we can go into many different cases, the external pressure may help, but what really lasts is when there are internal solutions. These are where the lasting solutions are. For example, in Rwanda, they have used indigenous techniques of conflict resolution, sitting down at the local level and going back to their own ways of dealing with conflicts locally. These are bottom-up solutions, not the top-down solutions that we hear, that come about. The real goal for a lasting solution must be a transformation in the social relations. This is a tall order. The United States never had an American Revolution. There was never a restructuring of social relations that went on here. We had a rebellion in the United States against the British Crown. So the question that was posed for this panel was, how does post-war rebuilding affect geopolitics? The answer, to pull off what I've said together, is that a just and durable peace is really the goal. It's what kind of world do we want? And this comes about through social transformation. Thank you.
Thank you for those responses. We have a few really great questions from the audience, and I think there's one in particular that touches on a few points that came up, and it was in these countries that are embroiled in conflicts or that are coming to an end, or where the conflicts are coming to an end, that have complicated histories with nation building from the likes of the United States, Britain, France, or colonialism. What role do Western countries and the global North have, if any, in post-conflict reconstruction?
I think I have something to say about that. I think the most important role is to stop bankrolling the violent conflict. I think there needs to be a decision to stop doing that, because as long as someone is bankrolling the weapons, the violent armed conflict will never stop. And this is happening not only in Palestine, Israel, it's happening in Sudan, where the conflict is being bankrolled by other Arab Muslim countries, unfortunately. It's happening, still conflicts happening in Lebanon, in Syria. Syria, things have, quieted down a little bit, but Israel has, annexed even more parts of the southern part of Syria. So it's never going to end unless we stop. We start with that, like boycotting, basically. Stopping the armed the provision of arms, to these parties, whoever they are. Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a need for role clarity in a lot of these conflicts, right? That if you want to help people that are overcoming conflict, conflict isn't about you, it's about those folks who are dealing with conflict and whose assistance you are providing only because they are asking and seeking it. You can't go in and to Rani's point, be the person either trying to play all sides of the conflict, supporting one side of the conflict, and then turning around and saying you're the mediator. A, nobody believes that, but B, it's just bad practice. And so, I think that from a conflict resolution perspective, if you're interested in intervention stuff, you're interested in intervention stuff because you want to help people. And to Jim's point, you are being guided by what those folks are seeking for their future. It's not about your future, it's not about your political interests, even though there may be some soft power benefits to it. It's about them. And, that's what, at least from a conflict resolution perspective, makes conflict resolution and grassroots peace building a very different process than what we might think of as kind of the statist formation, and that this is all just part of power politics and getting your way.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I agree with all of that. I do think it has to be a grassroots approach. Obviously, you need to get buy-in from the people that have been affected by the conflict. But that's not to say that there's not a lot of lessons learned out there and things that have been done over the years in terms of going into post-conflict situations and working in societies that have been completely destroyed with institutions and so on and so forth. I worked for a couple of years for an organization called the National Democratic Institute, and while I wasn't in a post-conflict situation, I was in the country of Guyana, which had a dictatorship for 30 years, and so there was no kind of democratic process, no type of institutions whatsoever. And while we were coming with aid from the United States, we were using people from all over the world, experts, and working with the Guyanese who had no expertise at that point. So I think I think it's wrong when we say that it's not a colonialistic approach as much as if there is some talent out there and there is some expertise that can work on post-conflict, whether it's judicial system, whether it's civil society, whether it's the legislature or elections, then that ought to be used.
Yeah, I would look, the question was about Western powers. And I look more toward local solutions. There has to be a will. And, there's a very complicated relationship between the United Nations and regional organizations when it comes to settling conflicts. The UN Charter is a compromise that was reached about this. But who should go in first, the regional organization or the more global organization? It's not clear whether an international organization should actually go in. And I'm thinking that there are other means of bringing pressure to bear on the local parties and bringing them together. In Africa, they're the elders. It was Mandela and Graça Machel and others who came together who had a certain rapport and could speak the language. Language, I'm not talking just about verbal language, but about the customs, the habits of the people who understood the context. It has to be contextual. The organizations that are formed are like they're tools, like their hammer or a saw, but the tools don't work by themselves. Someone has to have the will to use them, and it has to be the local parties. So this is where I would place the emphasis.
But I wanted maybe to comment on that. I mean, how far are local parties independent and not somehow infiltrated or taken over by external parties that are supporting them? Like, for example, one of the reasons why in Egypt, for instance, we have gone back to a very dictatorship-like situation, actually a dictatorship, a military dictatorship again. And that's what we rose up against in 2011. We have maybe 60,000 political prisoners. Nobody's talking about them. Nobody's allowed to say anything. Like, we know, for example, that 500 websites have been blocked. I can't read Al Jazeera when I'm in Cairo, for example. So it's not something. It's a secret. It's not a secret, right? So the reason why this was allowed to happen was because external factors and external interest groups in the Arab world, mostly, have been meddling. So that internal dialogue process is not even allowed to happen because who has the money, who has the tanks, who has the guns, who has control over the police and the military? So I don't know. That's my experience in Egypt, and I'm seeing it being replicated. Hopefully, not anymore in Syria and in other places.
On that note, I would actually like to ask a follow-up question that all of you please feel free to answer. But does the nature of the conflict, whether it's a revolution, civil war, an invading country, impact the sustainability of the reconstruction process?
I can go. I do think the type of conflict matters, and I say this not so much whether it's a revolution or civil war, but I think when it breaks down along identity lines is where we see the absolute most difficulty in dealing with these situations, right? And identity can look a lot of different ways. It can be ethnicity, it can be religion, but when that becomes mobilized and that becomes the de facto organizing principle of the society, the violence seems to be a lot more intense, and the challenges in getting folks to kind of break from those identities, especially if those identities get mobilized into political voting patterns or anything else in the post-conflict period, it just gets really, really hard, right? Because then it becomes kind of fractional infighting over making sure that your group has power rather than resolving the issues.
Yeah, I agree. Like we've seen that in Iraq, for example, right? After, you know, when the conflict became like Sunni Shia, so it just kept coming back. And like in Lebanon, you know, the identities and the religious minorities, there's always that going on. And it is about, you know, having a say, having the power to, you know, make decisions on a state level. Who makes those decisions? Who gets voted into office, et cetera, et cetera. But in situations like Egypt, the counter-revolution, you have another military rule, and everyone is shut up. Nobody can do anything, and nothing changes. And it's this, you know, everything simmering under the surface, and eventually it's going to explode again. So there has not been any conflict resolution because too many people were, you know, were killed and affected by the conflict, and there was never reconciliation. There was never justice, any kind of justice being reformed. Like we would see people, you know, like being driven over with tanks and stuff like that, and it's like nobody has been held accountable for when that doesn't happen. It's just this like latent period and then the conflict will come back again. So.
Yeah, I think the type of conflict very much affects the kind of rebuilding that has to be done. And we can talk about the cleavages that exist, but much of it is about the next generation. What are the stories that are told? What are the narratives? How are the narratives crafted? And this is a matter of really public education. The museums can play a tremendous role here with public education. I've often gone to post-conflict situations, and I like to go on the tours with children and listen to the narratives and to look at the scripts that are written, the narratives underneath the different photos in the exhibits, and to discuss them. Who are the narrators? Who is preparing the next generation? I'll share with you a very embarrassing situation I had when I was living and working in South Africa. There's a new apartheid museum that was created, and I spent a day there going around the museum and looking at the interpretive plaques, the narratives that are told. And about 10 o'clock at night, I was back in my hotel room, and there was a knock on the door, and he said, "Hey, Jim, it's Chris. You want to go out for dinner?" I said, "Chris, I had dinner 3 hours ago." You know, things happen a bit spontaneously when you're in Africa. It's a little bit different from the ways we have here in the West. And I said, "Sure, let's go out for dinner." So he said, "What'd you do today?" I said, "Oh, I went to the new apartheid museum." He said, "How'd you like it?" I said, "Well, I didn't like it so much." He said, "Why not?" I said, "Because of the narratives." And so we discussed this somewhat. He said, "You know, Debbie and I wrote those narratives that you're talking about." Debbie's a historian who wrote the foremost history of apartheid. And so my point with him was, you only told the ANC story. There are other liberation movements. You know, you lionized Nelson Mandela. Mandela often said himself he didn't make the anti-apartheid movement, he just represented it. But there are other stories, there were other struggles that were told, various liberation movements. I said, you should have told these stories. So I was embarrassed, but this is really about public education. Murals are very important, the artwork, the music, and so on. These are ways of healing and bringing people together. In some ways, they go much deeper. Yes, you need the immediate situations. You have to calm it down. You have to tamp it down. I agree with everyone else. But you also have to go to the cultural and the educational level if it's really going to stick, and get at those young minds and say, look, let's heal this. Let's get over it. Let's get past it. And ask how our country can move on.
Just to sort of piggyback on that a little bit in terms of coming up with that narrative that is important to reconciliation, I think the whole reconciliation process, whether it be a peace and reconciliation, whether it be prosecutions, whatever is appropriate for that conflict, can really benefit, or that process can hopefully create a narrative, agreed upon narrative, that for the people who have been the victims. And that's really, really hard. I know in the former Yugoslavia, everybody thinks differently, and they've tried this, and they've tried to use education as well, and they haven't got to the point where there's an agreed upon narrative, and I think largely because there really hasn't been an effective reconciliation process.
John, I actually had a question for you regarding Yugoslavia. So you have worked in some pretty devastating post-conflict areas, whether it's Sudan, Afghanistan, or Yugoslavia. What differentiated them in terms of the process afterwards? Because, at least from my perspective, Yugoslavia, or the former Yugoslavia, they have cultural and ethnic differences, but they've created a more sustainable post-conflict
I
setting.
think probably, and I kind of defer to my academic friends over here, but I think a lot has to do how the conflict was resolved. I think a lot has to do with the international community, and look at Sudan, where there really hasn't been much of a focus at all, and it certainly isn't in a post-conflict situation, whereas the former Yugoslavia, where it happened in the middle of Europe, there certainly was much more of an attention given to Yugoslavia in terms of post-conflict resources and assistance there. So I think those two factors are huge, how it eventually is resolved, and then the resources that go into trying to work on those post-conflict measures.
I'm just wondering, like, how effective is the international community now compared to, during that conflict in the former Yugoslavia? I mean, I don't see that it's being effective at all, or even, impactful if, like, funding is being funneled out of it from the U.S., for example. Like, USAID funding has now, like, killed so many projects all over the world now that it's been taken out. I don't know. I think maybe you can, or maybe Michael.
Go ahead, John.
Michael?
No, it looked like you were going to say something.
Well, yeah, clearly. I mean, when I read about, what's being completely obliterated from a USAID, it's a lot of the work that I've done in my life was funded by USAID, and it wasn't. I mean, and I think some really positive programs, whether it be in the former Yugoslavia, Sudan, Guyana, all geared toward, call it soft power, call it whatever, that have been completely obliterated. And it affects our security here at home. And I don't think that gets much emphasis. That so much of what has been done, and lives have been lost when you think of, whether it be medical programs or whatever, that it has been absolutely devastating. And people might talk about, well, this gives, other countries an opportunity to step up to the plate. And yes, other countries can perhaps step up to the plate. But at the end of the day, done in such an abrupt fashion, I think will take a long time to recover.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I am, Luca mentioned I wrote a book, and that book is hypercritical of the U.S. Institute of Peace, right? Not because I think there shouldn't be an Institute of Peace, but it was, is this Institute of Peace doing more to promote peace, or is it just promoting things that the U.S. is interested in that are kind of greatly detached from its purpose, and therefore just one more organization in D.C. that's, you know, giving out money for certain things. But, you know, I think that this is a challenge, especially for people on the left, that when we talk about these issues, like, yeah, there's a whole lot of problems with USAID, 100%. Does that mean getting rid of USAID, or does that mean reforming USAID to be more in line with the goals that it is supposed to do, to be kind of approving projects that are more effective than less effective, right? That there are all kinds of questions that you can have about development and peace-building support organizations that are productive and that deal with questions of efficacy. But, you know, to me, I think, and running to your point, right, there is this thing that happens, and I think that I'm a product of it, of asking how does intervention look different as a result of 9/11 and before 9/11? Right, and I think those are differences that are really important, because as we studied these things, you know, the 1990s is this great period, if we can use the word great, of intervention and of the international community saying that it's important to perhaps intervene, sometimes more muscularly, sometimes less, and learning a lot of lessons that really shifts when the United States says, we're going to do whatever the hell we want. You can come with us, but we're going to do whatever the hell we want, right? And that since that period, all of this stuff that we're interested in, especially if you're interested in the post-conflict side, gets wrapped up with the war on terror in ways, especially for local populations, especially for people in developing countries in the global south, that is really suspect, right? Are you here because you're interested in doing the thing, or are you here because this is part of this agenda that the U.S. has now unleashed on the world? And I think it's had real consequences for the development field, for the peace and security field, that we as a field haven't been good at dealing with, right? Because a little bit of it has been, well, if we kind of go along with what's happening, this at least gives us access to these spaces that we otherwise couldn't get in, and so maybe we'll hold our nose and do a project here because we can get in. And I'm not sure that that's been great, but what it's really done to us in this moment in which all of these programs that we were like, hey, maybe the job here is to reform and improve how we're doing this, it hasn't given us a lot to stand on with communities that are looking at it and seeing the slash and burn and going, okay, well, did you get what you wanted now that things are totally gone, right? And no, right? I'm one of those people that's like, this is a terrible, terrible thing to just cut all of this assistance from the world, even in the kind of most, we'll say, banal uses of foreign assistance. But, you know, I think I'm kind of winding away from your point, but I think that it matters that that shift after 9/11 didn't come with a corresponding shift of, hey, can we make sure that we're protecting this post-conflict development space from these things that are associated with the war on terror?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm also thinking about like the illegal migration crisis that happened. Like, you know, there are so many aspects of it. Like from my perspective, from Doha, for example, I know someone who works for IOM, which is the International Organization for Migration, and Qatar was one of those transitional countries where Afghan refugees or people trying to flee Afghanistan after the US very quickly and pulled out. You know, we all saw the images of people hanging onto airplanes trying to leave, right? And when the USAID funding was abruptly stopped, everyone was fired. Like the entire, because USAID was funding basically 70% of that organization, and everyone was fired. And then so that whole program just kind of stopped. And those people have been there for years. nobody knows anything about them. And in transition, because the organization was supposed to, process their cases and see where they're going to be, where they're going to seek asylum, in which countries, and now all of this, and these are thousands of people. So, I mean, yeah.
It's left a huge void.
Yeah.
To continue this conversation about international aid, we have a question from the audience asking, what role can international humanitarian aid organizations play in a post-conflict environment, primarily those who have a pillar of neutrality, and how can this be navigated? And any of you, please feel free to answer.
Well, I have some experience with evaluating programs, some bilateral programs, but mostly multilateral programs. And I find that there's been a recurrent problem when so-called experts, and I've been called an expert, and I hate the term. I always disavow any expertise. When people are helicopter into a certain country where they do not know the language, where they do not know the context, and they're asked to say, well, how does this project fit in the locality? And when they don't have a sense of how a bilateral initiative works in a country where you're also receiving aid from the Scandinavian countries, or from Belgium, or from China and other parts of the world, where there's a great deal of duplication. So and where there is not sufficient consultation with local people. The planning should really come from the grassroots up, not from the top down, saying, here's what we'll do, here's what we can afford, here's what you need. And so when I have been given a form with preset questions and asked by the UN or by the US government to answer these questions that are predetermined, it just doesn't work at all. And what I've said in so many words, more diplomatically than what I'm going to say right now, is if you want to fund this, just give it to grassroots organizations that you have confidence in, and let them do what they think they need, not to impose external projects.
Yeah, Luke, go ahead, Raina.
No, I was just clapping. I agree.
I was just going to say, there's some really interesting work on what are called everyday peace indicators as a way of thinking about how do you support communities. And it's very participatory, but it starts from going to the community and saying, tell us how you understand these issues. And I have some colleagues, Pamina Furchow, Roger McGinty, who do this work. And one of the things that I think stands out for most people when they look at it is they give this example of kind of going to a village somewhere and saying, how do you know when it's safe? And the response isn't, we see men on the streets with guns, the police pass all the time. They're like, the dogs aren't barking. That's how we know when we're safe.
Kids are playing.
Right? So if you're starting from there and the answer is the dogs aren't barking, there's a whole lot more interesting questions you then get to ask as you start to design programs, because those programs are clearly starting from what does this community need, how do they see their situation, and what's best for them. As opposed to what we talked about earlier, just coming in and saying, well, we know what security is. Security is buying a whole lot of law enforcement and making sure they have the right equipment to be in your community. And perhaps not appreciating that this community may have a very different opinion about what it's like to interact with law enforcement. But I think that kind of bottom-up thinking, if you take it seriously, really shapes what your engagement looks like with these programs from every aspect, from development all the way through implementation, and then what you're setting for your evaluation metrics.
I also think it sort of depends on what the situation is in terms of post-conflict. If you're in an emergency situation where lives are being potentially lost if there isn't some type of health intervention or whatever, then you know, that's very different than if it's a post-conflict development situation where you're thinking long term. So I think you have to take those things into, and generally it does. But I do also recognize, because I've been doing this a long time, that the international development through USAID or whatever organization has really made significant progress from what I first started 40 years ago. There was no such thing as human rights-based planning or any of that kind of stuff, and very little credence was given to local players. I think that's been completely reversed, and I think that's what's so, you know, what's difficult to sort of swallow these days is to know that so much progress has been made, and now that's all just been completely yanked away.
So we only have 5 minutes left, and there are a lot of great questions to get to, and I'm going to do my best to combine 4. And if each of you could take around a minute to answer them, that would be appreciated. There are some conflicts that seem like they're never going to end. They'll span generations, they'll spill over into other places, and more often than not, they are between ethnic groups, different religions, different religious groups, just across ideological lines. Is it possible that these conflicts can end in a lasting peace? And are there any processes that you believe haven't been tried yet or not enough that can really help bring a close to these conflicts?
Maybe I can talk about the conflict that is closer to my part of the world, obviously Israel, Palestine. And yes, there is a way to end it, just end the occupation, right? It's an occupation, it's not a conflict. I'm just calling it for convenience, but this has been like a 75-year occupation, and it just needs to end. And obviously, October 7 was a terrorist act or an act of resistance against occupation, however you want to see it. But there are ways to end that conflict if the entire Western world would stop supporting the occupation. I think it's easier said than done. Right now, the US president has proposed ethnically cleansing everyone from Gaza, and I don't know if he actually means that or he's serious about it, but I don't think that's a good way to end the conflict or the occupation. You can't just get rid of everyone on the land and then imagine that this is ever going to end. You know, so there are practical things we can do. Like right now, for example, for the Gaza reconstruction plan, Egypt had a proposal that was agreed on by most of the European countries, but the US administration and Israel refused it. So there needs to be, I think, a change of perspective, in my opinion, about this particular conflict. Yeah. So yeah. Thank you.
Well, I was just going to say that, yeah, in some instances, I think that, yeah, we can just end the conflict, but
and the occupation in this instance.
Yeah, I'm just talking about it in general, but I think not enough attention is given to sort of the long-term consequences and what can be done to prevent that conflict from reoccurring or even a new conflict. And some of the work that I've done has really focused on what's called human rights education, and at a very, very young age. And I think it's really, really important, and while it may not be a conflict, you know, preventer, so to speak, and it's so hard to measure because it really is about it's not a quick fix, it's about a long-term outcome. But I think if you're able to get the governments, and particularly the education system within the governments, to focus on the cultural systems, whether it be museums or so on and so forth. I used to work at the at the Holocaust Museum, and when Elie Wiesel created the museum, he said a museum unresponsive to the future would violate the memory of the past. And I think that is was very prescient. And while we haven't been very good at giving meaning to that phrase, never again, I do think the value of education is something that is critical.
I would just say we got to get people to think about the future, right? That if you want to resolve these things, to borrow something from people like John Paul Lederach, Elise Boulding, Viktor Frankl, you have to have people thinking, how do I live in a world which is a web of connected relationships, even with people I may disagree with or people who may have harmed me in the past? And if we can't think about living together, there's no reason to pretend that we're going to figure this stuff out.
Yeah, some conflicts never end. There's a draw. Take North Korea and South Korea. I mean, this was a draw, and the conflict never ends. There's simply a dividing line that exists there. So what can be done to try to stop conflicts? What can people here in this room do? Well, we have to be aware of certain CIA interventions around the world, in Latin America, for example, in Chile, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, with the assassination of Lumumba, and so on, to stop those interventions. It's a question of arms flows and arms production. Trump has just announced that he wants $1 trillion budget for the Pentagon for next year, at the same time that the social spending is going down in the United States. Those are things that we can try to stop or bring pressure to bear. There's money going from churches, for example, from evangelicals into anti-gay movements in parts of the world. These have created domestic conflicts and a great deal of persecution of individuals and so on. There's a lot that can be done to try to tamp down the conflicts.
Well, thank you guys so much. I don't know about the audience, but I really enjoyed the panel.
Thank you, Luca.
And I think there were a lot of really valuable things to take away and think about. So, thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
good job, Luca.